In 2025, the housing market was so totally frozen that the median age of a first-time home buyer quietly crept all the way up to 40 years old.
Yeah, 40. It's wild.
Right. Like, think about that for a second. If you're listening to this and trying to navigate the market, you know the feeling. An entire generation found themselves just completely trapped. People were sitting in their homes, clutching those 3% pandemic era mortgages.
Holding on for dear life.
Exactly, staring down 7% interest rates, and absolutely nobody was willing to blink. But fast forward to right now, looking out over 2026, and the ice is finally starting to crack. The question for you, if you're trying to figure out this space, isn't really whether the market is thawing. It's whether we're getting a light spring drizzle or, a Category 5 flood.
Which, honestly, is the most difficult kind of environment to predict.
Yeah.
I mean, you have all these overlapping forces just colliding at once. Interest rates are shifting. Unprecedented federal legislation just passed. And property management technology is completely rewriting the operational rules. The signals aren't just mixed right now. They're aggressively contradictory, depending on where you look.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are digging into a massive stack of fresh sources today. We've got national market forecasts, PropTech software analysis from the Mind Studios, and some really hyper-local ground truth data from the Texas Gulf Coast.
Yeah, the local data is really telling.
It really is. But before we can figure out what happens tomorrow, we need to dissect that 2025 gridlock. The numbers we have from HAR.com lay out the psychology of the freeze perfectly. As of mid-2025, over 80% of American homeowners were locked into mortgage rates below 6%.
Right, which is the textbook definition of the lock-in effect. But on an unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
It wasn't that families suddenly lost the desire to move. Life was still happening. People were getting new jobs, having kids, retiring. But the basic household math simply broke down.
Because if you traded a $2,000 monthly payment at 3%.
Exactly. For a theoretically cheaper house at 7%, your monthly payment would still skyrocket.
Yeah.
It just pushed homeownership entirely out of reach for millions and killed the standard life cycle of the housing market.
Which is what makes the forecasts for 2026 so fascinating. The major players, they all agree on the baseline data, but they wildly disagree on human behavior.
Oh, completely.
Like Fannie Mae, the Mortgage Bankers Association, Zillow, they all essentially agree that 2026 mortgage rates will settle somewhere around 6.0 to 6.4%.
Right.
But they fundamentally disagree on what that actually means for sales volume. Realtor.com predicts an incredibly meager 1.7% growth in existing home sales.
A drop in the bucket.
Yeah, basically nothing. But meanwhile, the National Association of Realtors is calling for a massive 14% boom. It's like meteorologists looking at the exact same radar, and one says light drizzle and the other says hurricane.
What's fascinating here is that that 12-point gap reveals a total uncertainty about buyer and seller psychology. Will someone with a 3% mortgage finally throw in the towel and just accept that 6% is the new normal baseline?
Right. Who blinks first?
Exactly. Realtor.com says no, they'll stay put. The NR says yes, all this pent-up demand will finally explode. But there's a wild card that just entered the equation in March 2026, attempting to alter that math entirely from the supply side.
Yeah, let's look closely at the mechanics of what happened in Washington last month, because it alters the landscape overnight, and we need to look at exactly what these sources are saying impartially.
Right, the legislation.
Yeah. On March 12th, the Senate passed the bipartisan 21st Century Road to Housing Act by a resounding 89-10 vote.
A massive margin.
Huge. And the very next day, President Trump signed 2 executive orders. One was titled Promoting Access to Mortgage Credit, and the other was Removing Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Home Construction. So what are the actual gears turning inside this legislation?
Well, the mechanisms are actually highly targeted. The Promoting Access to Mortgage Credit order directly zeroes in on community banks and credit unions, specifically those with less than $100 billion in assets.
Okay.
It directs the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to tailor the Dodd-Frank qualified mortgage requirements. And to understand why this matters, you have to look at the old TREE-ID framework. That's the TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule.
Which was notoriously strict.
Unbelievably strict.
Yeah.
Historically, under TREE-ID, if a local bank missed a single signature or made a tiny good faith typo on a closing disclosure, they could face catastrophic, literally company-ending fines.
Oh.
It made local lenders terrified to write a mortgage for anyone who wasn't an absolutely flawless borrower on paper.
So they basically function in a state of constant paranoia.
Entirely. So this new executive order shifts the regulatory environment to a correction-first standard. It allows those smaller local banks to lend to creditworthy buyers in their communities without that looming terror of devastating penalties over a simple paperwork glitch.
And the second order puts the Department of Housing and Urban Development on a strict 60-day clock to develop best practices for state and local governments, basically to explicitly cap permit timelines and fees.
Right. And if you look at the structural intent of both the legislation and the orders, it's a profound pivot.
How so?
Instead of trying to solve the affordability crisis by subsidizing buyer demand, which, let's be honest, usually just inflates home prices further.
Yeah, it just adds more money chasing the same houses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These policies aim to solve it from the supply side. They're slashing the red tape that stops homes from being built, and they're injecting institutional liquidity into the smaller lenders who actually finance local development.
I see the structural logic there, definitely.
Okay.
But I have to push back a little on how it translates to the everyday market.
Okay, sure.
If we go back to that divide between Realtor.com and the NAR, if mortgage rates only drop from 7% down to, say, 6.2%, does a family sitting on a pandemic-era 3% rate really pack up and sell their home just because developers can suddenly pull building permits a little faster?
For that specific family, probably not immediately, no.
Right.
Supply-side relief isn't really designed to rescue the homeowner with the golden handcuffs. It's designed to empower developers to build entirely new inventory faster and cheaper.
Oh.
That creates fresh options for that 40-year-old first-time buyer we talked about, who has been completely locked out of the secondary market because no one is selling. And realistically, if everyday families aren't putting inventory on the market, we have to look at who is actually driving the transactions right now.
Which brings us to a total structural shift in the market. The real vehicles driving this thaw aren't necessarily individual families trading up. It's institutional money paired with a massive technological revolution in property management.
Yes, the big money.
The Apollo institutional data points out a staggering reality here. The United States is currently facing a 4 million home shortfall, projecting out to 2029.
And that structural deficit basically guarantees a floor for long-term demand. And Apollo highlights another really crucial data point. The cost of owning a home has nearly doubled relative to the cost of renting one.
Doubled. That's insane.
It is. And that math is fueling an absolute avalanche of institutional capital into multifamily properties and build-to-rent communities. And it's not happening in a vacuum either. Apollo also notes that $2.3 trillion is currently being committed to AI data centers.
Wait, 2.3 trillion?
Trillion with a T, which is violently reshaping commercial real estate and local infrastructure.
And that technological integration bleeds straight into the residential side, too. We've got incredibly granular data from the Mind Studios looking at property management software, and the behavioral shifts are just wild.
Oh, the digital expectations have totally flipped.
Yeah. Their data shows that 65% of rental demand today comes from millennials and Gen Z. And if you are a landlord and you don't have digital instant lease capabilities, your vacancy periods will be 25% longer.
Because that demographic expects a perfectly frictionless digital transaction. I mean, they aren't going to print a background check.
No one owns printer anyway.
Exactly. They're not mailing a physical security deposit or playing phone tag with a leasing office. If they can't tour the place, get approved, and fund it from their phone in 10 minutes, they simply move to the next listing.
And the financial penalty for ignoring that behavior is severe. The Mind Studios calculates that for every 15 to 20 days a unit sits vacant, a landlord is losing between $2,500 and $4,000 per unit.
And you cannot recover that lost income.
Never. But the tech shift goes way beyond just building a better app to collect rent. The analysis dives into the new environmental, social, and governance or ESG mandates sweeping the industry. Things like the EU's Energy Performance of Buildings Directive or the new SEC climate disclosure rules. If properties don't meet these green standards, they're seeing valuations drop by up to 25%.
And to understand why a building's value plummets like that, you have to look at the capital markets. If your building isn't green compliant, the major institutional banks and pension funds are increasingly restricted from lending you money to refinance it.
They just won't touch it.
Yeah. When you cut off a property's access to modern, affordable financing, the value of the asset just craters. You're essentially blacklisted from institutional capital.
Wait, okay. Compliance by design is the phrase the Mind Studios uses to solve this. And honestly, it sounds like high-level corporate jargon. Does that just mean, like, using algorithms as a digital hall monitor for my building's thermostat?
Well, it's actually much more structural than that. The old way of operating was manual compliance monitoring. So a property manager would track energy waste or carbon output after the fact, reviewing spreadsheets at the end of the month.
Right.
That might work if you own 3 duplexes, but it fails completely if you manage 3,000 units. Compliance by design is proactive. It means installing smart HVAC systems and IoT sensors that automatically optimize energy use based on real-time occupancy and weather data.
Oh, I see.
The architecture of the building software literally prevents the violation from occurring in the first place.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's basically like bowling with the bumpers up. You literally cannot throw a gutter ball on your ESG compliance because the building's central nervous system simply won't allow you to violate the mandate.
That's a perfect analogy. The system structurally enforces the compliance.
But I'm looking at the cost of those bumpers, and it's terrifying for the average person. The Mind Studios notes these IoT and ESG tech upgrades cost anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000 per property.
Yeah, it's a massive capital expenditure.
So are mom-and-pop landlords going to be squeezed out entirely here? Like, if you own a modest 4-unit building for your retirement, how on earth do you survive a 6-figure tech upgrade just to stay compliant?
The blunt reality is that many of them won't.
Wow.
This technological leap places a tremendous consolidation pressure on the market. Institutional investors have the war chests to implement this technology across thousands of units simultaneously. That drives down their per-unit operating costs and secures better financing rates.
While the little guy is stuck.
Right. The smaller operators who can't stomach the $100,000 upgrade are going to be left holding buildings with higher utility costs, plummeting valuations, and severely restricted access to bank loans.
So the big fish eat the small fish because they can afford the better tech.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take all these macro concepts we've been floating, the thawing rates, the slashed federal red tape, the really expensive tech-driven optimization, and see how they actually behave in the dirt, because the Texas Gulf Coast is a perfect microcosm for this.
Oh, absolutely. The Houston metropolitan area has always been an incredible test case because it historically marches to its own economic rhythm, largely detached from the national mood.
Right. The HAR.com data shows how Houston typically tracks oil cycles, enduring the massive bust in the 80s, the downturns in the 2010s. But looking at the February 2026 data, the market is showing a return to normalcy. And the internal friction here is fascinating.
Yes, the numbers are pulling in opposite directions.
Exactly. Pending sales in Houston are actually up 13% as buyers get off the sidelines for the spring. But simultaneously, the average days on market just jumped to 69 days, hitting a peak we haven't seen since March 2013.
That 69-day metric perfectly illustrates the friction of a thawing market. You have more buyers actively touring homes, which drives up those pending sales. But those buyers are stretched incredibly thin by 6.5% mortgage rates.
So they're taking their time?
They are being hyper-selective. Meanwhile, sellers are still anchoring their expectations to the chaotic bidding wars of 2021, so the two sides just stare at each other, and homes sit on the market longer.
And when you zoom in on specific coastal submarkets, the contrast is completely jarring. Let's compare Galveston and Manville. Down in Galveston, it's firmly a buyer's market. The median price is around $425,000, which is actually down nearly 2% year over year. Homes are sitting for 75 days. But here's the kicker. Galveston's median rents are up over 6% to $1,600 a month.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it validates the Apollo data point perfectly. When the cost of ownership remains stubbornly high due to interest rates, but home prices are softly declining, people smartly choose to rent.
It just makes more sense.
Right. Renting isn't a failure to launch in 2026. It's a strategic financial choice for flexibility while the market figures itself out.
But then you look inland at Manville, Texas. Redfin's data paints a painfully slow picture. Homes in Manville are sitting for 130 days on average. Sales volume plummeted 25.5% year over year.
And that's where the migration data gets really interesting.
Yeah. Redfin tracks this incredibly odd migration pattern. Buyers from St. Louis, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. are actively moving into Manville. But local Manville residents are searching for homes in Sacramento, Seattle, and Austin.
What you're seeing there is geographic arbitrage.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, a buyer from Los Angeles can sell a modest starter home, take that significant equity, and treat a $500,000 new build in Manville like an absolute bargain, even with the higher interest rates.
Oh, sure. To them, it's cheap.
Exactly. The locals, however, are feeling the squeeze of stagnant local wages against nationalized home prices, which prompts them to look elsewhere.
So what does this all mean if you are actually out there trying to buy a house this year? If homes are sitting for 69 days in Houston and an agonizing 130 days in Manville, but the headline prices aren't actually crashing, how do you play the steering contest with a seller?
By fundamentally changing what you negotiate for. The data shows that 2026 rewards patience and precision. Sellers loathe dropping their headline price because it damages their perceived equity and it hurts neighborhood comparable sales.
Right, it's a pride thing.
Mostly, yes. So, as a buyer, look for a home that's been sitting for over 60 days. Instead of demanding a $15,000 price cut, negotiate hard for seller concessions.
Like what?
Ask them to fund a temporary rate buy-down on your mortgage for the first 2 years, or have them cover your closing costs entirely. The seller gets to keep their pride on the final sales price, and you get a drastically lower monthly payment when you actually write the check.
That is a brilliant tactical approach, seriously. But before we close out, there is a massive hidden variable in all of these forecasts.
The climate data.
Yes, you can pass all the federal legislation you want to cut red tape. You can optimize your property with all the AI sensors on the market. You can negotiate the best rate buy-down possible, but you absolutely cannot negotiate with the weather.
This raises an important question, and it's where the hyperlocal data exposes a glaring paradox in the entire 2026 outlook.
It's pure cognitive dissonance. We have a source from Coastline Properties. They're a prominent real estate group operating around Corpus Christi and Padre Island, and they put out a report painting an incredibly rosy, optimistic picture for summer 2026.
Predicting a boom.
Yeah, predicting a bright summer ahead for coastal development and explicitly basing their optimism on the new executive orders and the unleashed liquidity from community banks.
And to be fair, from a purely regulatory standpoint, their optimism is totally logical. The capital is there, and the permits are easier to get.
But then you cross-reference that financial optimism with Redfin's integrated climate data from the First Street Foundation, specifically looking at Brazoria County and Manville. The numbers are terrifying.
They really are.
According to the data, 100% of properties in Manville are at extreme risk of a severe wind event, projecting future hurricane gusts up to 173 miles per hour.
Wow.
100% of homes face extreme heat risk, with a projected 228% increase in days over 110 degrees. And 79% of the area faces severe flood risks.
We have to tie this back to the Apollo report, which specifically flagged property insurance premiums as one of the fastest rising operational costs in real estate today. This is where the macro theory collides with physical reality. If 100% of a town is at extreme risk for a 173-mile-per-hour wind event, it profoundly impacts those relaxed lending standards we discussed earlier.
Because the bank still needs the asset protected.
Exactly. The executive orders might remove the federal regulatory fear of writing a local mortgage, but if the physical property is deemed uninsurable by the private market, or, if the insurance premiums are so astronomically high that they double the borrower's debt-to-income ratio, the loan still cannot close.
Right.
The friction just moves from the government regulator to the insurance actuary.
So how can developers project unprecedented growth for coastal properties when the hard data explicitly states the very ground they are building on is at extreme risk for severe wind, crushing heat, and flooding? I mean, it feels like the entire market is just collectively choosing to ignore the thermometer so they can keep building.
The industry is currently pricing in the immediate joy of regulatory relief, while aggressively discounting the delayed pain of climate risk. But you can't out-legislate risk.
No, you can't.
As insurance premiums continue to skyrocket to reflect those 173-mile-per-hour wind projections, it will inevitably force a brutal correction in how and where we build, regardless of how fast a local government approves the permit.
Okay, let's bring all these threads together. What is the actual synthesis of this deep dive? It's clear that 2026 is not a return to the chaotic waive all your inspections frenzy of 2020.
No, definitely not.
What we are looking at is a complex recalibration to balance. Success in this environment, whether you're an institutional fund manager, a buyer looking for a starter home, or someone smartly choosing to rent it, rewards preparation.
Highly rewards it.
It requires utilizing compliance tech to prevent costs before they happen, recognizing when renting offers better leverage, and fundamentally accepting that mortgage rates hovering in the 6% range are simply the new normal.
It's a landscape that demands extreme vigilance. You have to evaluate the local physical risks just as harshly as you evaluate the national interest rates.
Which leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought to leave you with. We've spent time looking at how these 2026 executive orders are untethering smaller community banks, allowing them to lend more freely.
Right.
At the exact same time, we're watching AI algorithms and PropTech take absolute control over dynamic property management, valuation, and risk assessment.
Yes.
Given how those two forces are accelerating, could we see a near future where an AI, rather than a human loan officer or a government regulator, becomes the ultimate decider who gets mortgaged?
Oh, wow.
Imagine a localized algorithm that bypasses traditional FICO credit scores entirely. Instead, it approves or denies your 30-year loan based entirely on the hyperlocal climate risk model of your specific zip code, cross-referenced with the real-time ESG compliance score of the property's smart sensors.
When you combine the mounting uninsurability of extreme climate zones with the strict architectural demands of compliance by design, turning the actual underwriting process over to a predictive risk assessment, AI feels less like a dystopian sci-fi novel and much more like an operational inevitability.
It truly does. It seems the muddy waters of the housing market aren't necessarily clearing up. They're just being digitized and quantified in ways we've never seen before. This has been your custom deep dive into the 2026 housing landscape. Keep digging into the data and keep asking those great questions.